here. Hey folks, welcome to Strongtown's office hours. This is for our members who are continuing to support and build a movement for change across our communities. And today I'm really excited because Ariane Beck is a researcher as well as a leader in the field of solar energy, renewable energy, and identifying strategies for communities to address what it takes in order to make themselves more resilient, more capable of enduring over a long period of time, rather than being fragile or exposed to sudden shocks, sudden shifts and changes in the community. She wrote a great piece on that the grassroots is always greener, and which is a philosophy that we would really apply to so many aspects of strong towns, but certainly on the context of community-based organizations to help create shared solar energy. And so on one level, this might be a bit of a drift from some of our core topics of safe streets and parking and different elements of sort of our core campaigns. But I'll say, especially for you members, as you watch this, like one of the things that we love about Strong Tales is we cover a wide range of aspects of what it takes to build a good life in a prospering place. And so that's why I'm excited. When I connected with Ariane, I said, I want to hear more about the things that you're working on and understand this more deeply. And so, Ariane, can you introduce yourself and share a little bit more about the work that you do with the Texas Solar Energy Society as well?
All right. So yeah, I actually my initial background is in electrical engineering. And I kind of transitioned into the energy space through policy and worked with Professor Varun Rai at UT. And he's actually dual appointment engineering and policy. So I'm like, oh, more of
Mhm.
us. And there are more and more people that are looking at both spaces, which I think is great because you have technical systems. Most technical systems are actually socio-technical systems. And in engineering, we often forget the people that are, at the end of every
Mhm.
technology.
Yeah.
So what we really looked a lot at was how people are making decisions about solar. How is information about solar flowing, either, between companies who are trying to innovate and between those people who are trying to get the information to make good decisions. So it ends up being a lot of, behavioral economics and social psychology and diffusion of innovation kind of stuff that we ended up looking at. And the paper you mentioned was actually a project that we did with the Mitchell and the Meadows Foundations that was trying to figure out how we get more community solar in Texas. We have some projects, but we have a pretty complicated like energy system here in Texas, and I think it's actually pretty complicated everywhere. But yeah, and then through that, I actually met the executive director, Pete Parsons of the Texas Solar Energy Society. She's absolutely amazing. So we'll talk about some of the projects going on there. But yeah, so that's kind of how I got involved and just decided kind of I wanted to leave research and get more into implementation, more into, getting things out there. So.
Mhm. And can you help by defining, like, when you talk about community solar, is it installations in people's homes that are then connected to a local grid, or is there actually an element of communities running their own utility? What is sort of the range of different ways that might pop up in a community?
It's usually a larger installation, usually, some site usually nearby. They try and keep, some geographic proximity. And then they basically kind of sell a share of the production, or you kind of say that panel is mine, and then the utility company will then treat that as though it's yours when they do the billing. So it requires that the utility can kind of be able to do that.
Mhm.
But yeah, so it's a little bit kind of a virtual solar thing. And the idea is, if your house isn't suitable, if you're living in apartments, and you can't get the financial advantages of solar, then, some groups come along and they kind of say, okay, we'll build a larger array and we'll, you know, give it contract out a little bit to this person and that person, and that'll be their allocation. And that saves money in the long term. I think EnergySage.com, I saw the average community solar person was saving about 5 to 20%
Hmm.
on their electric bills.
Yeah.
Um, and that can be a really big deal for a lot of people. There are a lot of people where their electric bill is a substantial portion of their,
Yeah.
income. And when the Texas TEPRI, Texas Energy Poverty Research Institute, did a big survey on it, and they found, when people have to pay this energy bill, they're making sacrifices in healthcare or food or transportation, other aspects of their lives. So, being able to provide that has been, something that a lot of groups have been like, okay, we're going to use energy to help solve these problems.
That's fascinating because there's an element of it being bottom down, but or bottom up rather, but it's at the level at which the technical know-how is available to be able to
Mhm.
do it. Like if it was, hey, everybody, you get a solar panel, you get a solar panel, 9 out of 10 people wouldn't know how to hook it up. 8 out of 10 wouldn't know, which side was up. Like, there's elements that like at a very basic level, if you're out camping, you've got one of those little ones that powers your alarm clock, like that might work. Um,
Right.
but what is that sort of process of adopting it? Is it often citizen led? Is it often at sort of the behest of a vendor, for example, of like the virtual tools that tie it all together? Do they go and meet community after community and pitch them on it? Or do you find that there's actually more like grassroots activity to make this happen?
I mean, it really depends a lot on the community. I mean, that's what's interesting. There are campaigns called solarized campaigns where local members of the community, often local members of the community, sometimes it's higher up organizing, will get a whole bunch of neighbors together who want solar and then use that for bulk purchasing and to contract with a few installers. And then the soft costs come down considerably when you're doing a bunch of installations in the same neighborhood, as opposed to, driving all over the city, trying to find the customers and then having to drive all over to do the installations and the permits. And some of the more advanced ones will, work with the city to make sure that the inspections, they can just, run around the neighborhood instead of having to drive 30 minutes out to the house to meet the inspector. And then, it's all those, we call those soft costs. And I think other industries might use that term as well, but it's kind of all the things besides the equipment that just ends up racking up the cost. And yeah, that can be a big one. The customer acquisition can also be a big one. So a lot of times when you see a community group starting to organize and inform the community ahead of time, it can make it easier for a solar company to then come in and give people a better deal. Because a lot of times they spend the first installer in is basically educating the homeowner, you
Yeah.
know, and then they don't know when the person actually finally makes the decision. I think at one point we saw about a 6 to 9 month lag between first reaching out about solar and then like actually, picking an installer. So it can be hard for the installers when they have to take that job on of doing all the education. So, and that's part of what Texas Solar Energy Society, part of what we do is try to, provide that education and get that information out for people. So.
Yeah. For those that are just joining us, we're chatting with Ariane Beck, who is with the Texas Solar Energy Society, and we're talking about the work that she's done to study, but also help lead projects for distributed community solar, various elements of that. And shared at the intro just that, like, this is a part of those operating systems in our communities that often get sort of torqued or sort of distorted by like large scale installations that at a surface level are more efficient. But one of the things that we talk about in the context of strong towns is we often actually need to shy away from a max efficiency approach where like the largest installation is going to take care of our needs for the next 80 years versus an incremental approach that actually is more stable or more capable of that. How does that factor into what you're talking about here in terms of anticipating future needs, but also like at times there's the god of efficiency can sometimes have to be laid to the side in order to actually build more resilient communities.
That has been actually one of the major barriers. If you kind of look at the current business model, it's a very centralized system. And a lot of the utilities, like the investor-owned utilities, will actually have a fiduciary responsibility to put the lowest cost solution and pass on to the shareholders then.
Yeah.
So they're often in a position where they can't take anything into consideration besides how much is the development cost and how much can I sell it for?
Hmm. Yep.
That's what they can do. I actually here in Austin, Texas, we have a municipal utility, and they're actually beholden to the people. We own it as a city, the city council, and there's a commission of kind of more experts, but then they advise city council on how to make decisions. So they've been able to put in place other priorities like resiliency or reducing carbon footprint of the city and things like that. And so that's been really good to see kind of a model where you can start to prioritize things besides just the immediate, this quarter finance of the system.
Yeah.
And that is a big barrier. So there's also, research that has gone into what we call co-benefits, and we try to see like how do we try to work in other benefits that come with solar, like resiliency or They've even found if you put it out in in West Texas, the cows really like the shade and these heat waves we're having.
Yeah.
And it's actually helpful for the farmers to be able or ranchers, sorry,
Yeah.
ranchers, to, be able to, protect their livestock in these, a couple summers ago, we were at 110, 115, like every day. It was crazy. Um,
Hmm.
so yeah, they're kind of
Yeah.
interesting benefits. They're finding it can actually increase crop yields or not decrease them very much, where it can kind of protect them from sun, but
Yeah.
allow sunlight through if it's, particularly hot climate. So there are definitely some interesting benefits that you can get besides just the solar. The problem then is finding the business model where you can kind of capture all of those benefits in a way that you can find a party that's interested enough to then finance it.
Right.
Um,
Yeah.
and since the benefits accrue to so many different people, it can start to be kind of challenging um, to find that entity that's going to, take the initiative and get it going.
Hmm.
And that's actually where we see a lot of the community-based organizations.
Yeah.
I think a really great example we have kind of going on right now, our executive director has been working with the Community First Village here in town, and they are part of Mobile Loaves and Fishes. I'm trying to remember exactly. They have a lot of many acres of land. I forget exactly how much, and it's for basically people who've had chronic homelessness. They provide this land, they can come build tiny homes and things like that and have a place to live. And they're trying to build a community of support for people as well as they're trying to get back into, basically get out of that chronic homelessness. And so one of the things that we're trying to help them do is navigate getting solar installed so that they can get that energy production going. And that gives them one more source of security in creating the community because they don't have to worry about, large electric bills coming in and things like that. And so she's been kind of negotiating between, the city and the solar installers and finding a particular spot on the land where it would be appropriate to put in the solar.
Yeah.
Has been kind of a challenge. And so you have these technical challenges. And so what a group like ours can do, kind of the more technical community groups can do, is help people kind of navigate and bring together that, the technical assistance and the connections at the city and all of that need to go into making that happen. So,
Yeah. And
yeah,
providing that calm reassurance that this has been done elsewhere and it does work and it will
that's,
function, and you're going to benefit. And I'm fascinated by the point you made too about the distribution of benefit, or sort of the
mhm.
when it's more scattered or diffuse, there are real benefits. But if it's not directly to the shareholder, I for example, I've got a really poor mobile cell phone plan that I actually like lack coverage at my own house, but it was the cheapest on offer. And so as a result, I have bare coverage here, but it's just like I can't make phone calls. And yet on the cost per text, like it's the best. And yet like there was all of these other sort of frustrations that I've had to deal with. But one of those is the company can go out of business because it's not fly by night, but it is, it's
Yeah.
fragile in that way. And I think you're describing sometimes that element that when a community actually says, all right, what do we value? Maybe it won't be that like the finest margin of
Mhm.
affordability is going to like move us into a different direction. But you shared also that like yes, there are technical things, and you're an electrical engineer. You have the skill set to be able to like break down complex systems and
Mhm.
understand them more fully. But there's also the human component to it. Can you talk about like that element of what you do and kind of what you're seeing in terms of when communities feel like they are ready? What are some of the precursors to them becoming ready? And kind of what is that energy like, no pun intended, of actually helping people to take responsibility and control of their own sort of path, even in something that feels like it's very like, that's for the experts. What is that like?
I haven't been involved kind of at that kind of city level of organization, but I did work with a smart grid demonstration, and we were kind of came into the Miller neighborhood here in Austin. And if you're in urban planning, you may well have heard of it because it's kind of a new urbanism type design, redeveloping the former airport that we had. And this was almost 2010 maybe. So a while back when we're still trying to figure out what is going to happen to the grid when we load it up with solar panels and electric vehicles and all these other things. And one of the things people don't always think about is the grid is designed to get power to you. It's not designed to take power from you.
Mhm.
So a lot of times when a whole bunch of people are sending power back, that's when the equipment starts to get stressed. So we kind of got this funding to say like, hey, let's load up this community and see what happens when we start getting the market penetration we're expecting 10
Mm.
years down the line.
Yeah.
And so we did a bunch of initiatives, and then we looked at some of the older homes. This was kind of a newer community. We looked at some of the older homes nearby. And so we got some experience in how to deal with putting this same technology on, different generations of homes and that sort of thing. But the community was totally into it. They were doing even before we got there, they were doing porch talks.
Hmm.
And they would set up a time where they would just sit on their porch and you could come by and ask them about solar. And there was one neighbor who was a finance guy. So he created a calculator and he would help people plug in and figure out, is this going to make financial sense for me?
Yeah. Yeah.
One of the interesting things we've seen in neighborhoods like that, and we actually did research when I joined the group at UT on what's called peer effects. And so once people start seeing those solar panels go up, they start really thinking about it like, oh, hey, is that something I should do? It's kind of one
Mhm.
of the places where like the tract home developments actually become beneficial because they're all the same.
Right. Yeah.
And so they're the same size, they're the same age, they're the same builder. So if solar makes sense for your neighbor, it probably makes sense for you.
Mhm.
And people take that cue.
Yeah.
And so yeah, there's actually a lot of research showing that it's almost kind of like a contagious thing, getting solar panels. And their visibility really helps with that. Certainly compared to like energy efficiency improvements that you can't see at all.
Mhm. Mhm.
Yeah, the solar being very visible, definitely cues people that, hey, this might be something I should be looking into as well. So I think when you kind of start to see some of that groundswell from a community where certain members are trying, and then you kind of bring in more resources to help, and it ended up being a very solar dense neighborhood. It was a really just really neat kind of example to show people and kind of say, hey, this is what it can look like. Um, I would also say though, looking at a community, if you're starting to see people struggle, if you're seeing electric rates going up really quickly in your community and you're starting to see people struggle, this is where you probably want to start finding out, is there some way that we can help?
Mhm.
Will solar answer
Mhm.
that question?
Yeah.
Or help solve that problem? And that's where you kind of, in some of the research I did, we talked about finding mission aligned uses of solar where your goal isn't the energy. Your goal is, to help alleviate poverty or help with, people who have vulnerable health conditions, things like this. And you realize solar helps. And, I think a great example, I just read about it last week and I'm like, so just like gaga over this. It was a hospital in Boston, and the doctor realized that a lot of her patients, were struggling with their protocol because they didn't have access to energy all the time.
Mm.
And they looked in, I think they said in the video, they said something like they had 750 cases of a doctor having to call the utility to keep them from turning off the power. And so they were already installing solar and they decided we're going to make it community solar and we're going to give power prescriptions to our patients who
Mm.
will do much better if they have this energy, if they have nebulizers or CPAPs or they have, oxygen machines, things like this. And so that's, what they're working on now, qualifying, people to say like, okay, here's who we're going to give these prescriptions to. And then once they free up that money or that stress, that they're able then to use that for other things, transportation and prescriptions and things like that. So it's,
Mm.
even though it's
Mm.
kind of a different
Mhm.
resource, it all
Yeah.
comes down to like, what's your budget? And if you can clear out one part of the budget, you can use that money for something else.
Yeah.
So it was really neat to see examples like that and seeing, it's like for a doctor to just kind of come out of left field, hey,
Yeah.
let's do community solar. You're like, that's what we love to see when people who aren't in energy are seeing solar as that solution. Because it has a lot of power to help with that.
And it feels like something that is gradual or incremental, like it's on a site by site, sort of community by community basis. And so there's an element in which it's always being tested, always being refined. And I'm sure there's generational gaps between like older systems that were installed. And it's like, oh, maybe we could have done that better. But if it functions, then we're just going to leave it as is. But what are some of the large, like institutional or regulatory barriers that prevent widespread adoption of distributed energy systems?
I think a lot of it has to do with the way your particular utility is structured.
Hmm.
And it varies so much. Like you can't kind of say like here's one way or one thing. For instance, here in Austin Energy, you cannot sell energy unless you're the utility. It's a regulated monopoly, and that means they're the only ones who get to sell power.
Yeah.
So I can't, you know, put solar panels on my roof and allow my neighbor to plug into it. I can't do that. It's their service territory. And part of that is because the transmission and distribution system is so expensive
Mhm.
that you kind of need to guarantee those meters for that company. But then that company gets to set policy on how solar is going to be compensated.
Yeah.
So if I put solar on my roof and I'm out all day and then I come back and I use energy in the evening, well, okay, I gave it to the grid all day and now I'm taking from the grid, but you know, so we call that net metering, where they just kind of roll the meter forward and roll the meter backward, as the solar is
Mm.
producing and you're using it. A lot of companies are getting away from that because it's not great for their business model.
Yeah.
The other kind of fascinating aspect of the utility business model, and I don't know if you're aware of this, when it's a regulated utility, the way they increase their profits is when they make capital investment, they can recover those costs from the ratepayers plus 10%.
Mm. Hmm.
So I
Mhm.
recently read a case where energy usage was flat for the last 20 years in a particular utility, but the capital investment went up 300%.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right along with profits. And it's supposed to
Mhm.
be regulated. There's supposed to be somebody watching and saying, well, do you really need that? Or, how's that working? Is that really necessary? And that doesn't always work though. They're not always being watched that closely, or it's not always obvious that there's a cheaper solution,
Mhm.
versus a more expensive one being proposed. And they'll propose the most expensive one because they're not paying for it. They're just getting the profit.
Yeah.
With our municipal utility, that 10% goes back into the city budget. So our municipal utility doesn't particularly have an incentive to over-engineer the system just to make more profit. They don't keep it. It doesn't go to shareholders. And if they do that to us, it comes back to us. So that's at least helpful.
Right. Yeah.
But so you have these business structures, and so there's a lot of control over the system, and to do a lot of these bottom-up things, they basically have to give you control.
Yeah. Mhm.
And you can imagine that a lot of people don't want to do that when their revenue model is at stake.
Mhm.
So that's where we're kind of seeing some of the biggest challenges. Another interesting thing people are doing is called I think they're calling it a sustainable energy utility. And they're actually starting these as kind of parallel efforts with the kind of incumbent electric company to reimagine energy more as like a service. And in that case, they will start to set up programs for, installing solar and making energy efficiency improvements, or installing solar on the roof, and doing a bunch of these types of things. A lot of times it's with the city. And so they get that low interest capital that cities can get, and they can use that to really make those numbers pan out for their residents. And in that way, they can start to take more control of their energy supply. So that's a really interesting and encouraging thing, but it's fairly new. There aren't a lot of people doing it. And people are kind of still seeing how it's going to pan out, that's going to become kind of a sustainable thing to do. I think Ann Arbor is one of the ones that's just getting started, and there was some talk about actually trying to buy their utility. But it's a lot of old, outdated equipment there, kind of like, that's a huge liability and a huge expense. That's maybe not the best way to go. Let's try this other approach.
Mm.
So
Yeah.
I think um, so a lot of times you talk about with solar behind the meter or in front of the meter. If it's behind the meter, that's like your rooftop, that's your house, that's your church or your business, or kind of any entity, kind of standalone entity that you can start to take advantage of that solar immediately. And with batteries, which have now come down in price enough that a lot of people can do that, you don't have to worry about the net metering policies or how they're going to compensate you.
Yeah.
That has just been an ongoing issue in solar, where everybody gets going and they understand the policies, and then the policy changes and everybody stands still
Mm.
until
Mhm.
they figure out what the new policy is going to be and how it's going to impact all the projects.
Yeah.
It puts a lot of volatility, for all of those workers. It's really, really frustrating. But yeah, so with the batteries, that becomes less of an issue. You don't have to worry nearly so much about what is your utility going to do. So that has been really promising. And then one of the other aspects of the sustainable energy utility is they're looking at how do they start to interconnect the different facilities that have solar. So that'll be an interesting thing to watch and see how that goes and how regulation responds to that. There is an idea of energy democracy, and that's this idea that we all have, this is a huge system. it's largely paid for, federal tax dollars, right?
Mhm.
We should have a right to access it and participate in it.
Hmm.
When it was built, there was no way to do that. The equipment didn't support it. You just couldn't. So everybody's like, okay, fine. Well,
Yeah.
we have the equipment now. We can look at that. We have people who can aggregate a whole bunch of different solar installations, and they can kind of pull them together and manage them and then bid them into the market here in Texas as a just like any other kind of generation entity. It kind of falls under like the demand response, if you're familiar with that at all. But so ERCOT, our grid operator, is running a pilot right now to see how that might work and bring a lot of opportunities then into, for other people to participate, for lots of people to participate. Right now you can kind of only participate if you're at the point of like, oh, I can afford $1 billion power plant. So, for me personally, I love the idea that we're getting to that point where we can all kind of participate. Because to me, I look at power and I'm like, that is a life critical system.
Yeah.
And, you should know
Dialysis or yeah, whatever you
how it
happen to
works,
need. Yeah.
where it comes from. Do you
Yeah.
trust the entity that's providing it to you?
Yeah.
And, if you don't, and they say like, oh, but you don't have a right to do anything about
Yeah.
it.
Hmm.
I'm like, that doesn't sound right to me. I'm not too keen on that, that approach. So yeah, I think the energy, kind of the movement towards energy democracy and saying, hey, let's all participate in this system, um, is a really positive movement in that. And we have a lot of utilities that are starting to look at what they call value of solar. They assess the full value. Oh, we don't have to upgrade the distribution feeder because we have more generation. We don't have to do this upgrade or that upgrade. So we will compensate the people who put solar on. And so that's one thing that we push really hard for, in Texas. The Texas Solar Energy Society is, that kind of that value of solar idea, and understanding the full set of benefits. And that's really even just the energy system benefits.
Right. Yeah.
Obviously, there's all these resiliency benefits that come on top of that. And that I think that's something we're going to be focusing on a lot more. We just keep seeing more and more of these natural disasters. And every time it
Mm-hmm.
happens, more and more people install generators. Generators have their problems too. I
Hmm.
mean, it requires fuel use, it requires a lot of maintenance, it has health issues. So, there are groups who are working on how do we use solar in those situations so that we can free up the fuel for where it's absolutely needed. And a lot of places where they have the solar systems, there's a community in Florida during Milton, they didn't lose their power because they had the hurricane tie downs for the house. The solar was tied to that.
Okay. Hmm.
It didn't go anywhere.
Yeah.
It's still there. It's still generating. The developer for that community actually put a microgrid on it, and they're sitting pretty in the middle of, you know,
Blackout. Yeah.
blackout.
Yeah. That's
So
awesome. Yeah.
I think when people see that and they start to see the value of that, and communities that are developed like that, if we're going to do the master plan communities, right? That's not our strong town
Right.
model.
Yeah.
But if it's happening anyway,
Yeah.
can it start to happen with microgrids? We have one here in Austin that's doing ground source heat pumps,
Right.
and they're
Yeah.
putting in a large network for thermal energy, across the whole community. That's something that kind of has to be done up front with the community and kind of planned and coordinated at the outset. So it is great to see that where we do have that kind of planning, we're starting to see some innovation and how we can make better use of it and add some resiliency to it.
Yeah, and because this is an area where I love the layers of what we're dealing with, because we talk about like the idea of subsidiarity, that the entity that is best able to address that need or that emerging problem should be as close to the problem as possible. But oftentimes there's actually going to be sort of layers or increments at which it needs to be dealt with at a slightly,
Mhm.
in a sense, higher or broader sort of scope. And in that setting, we have different examples where with housing, with parking, for example, parking requirements are on a site by site basis. It's you and your two neighbors kind of have to figure out that nobody's, hogging all the space. And there's always going to be a market requirement, but the idea of like citywide zoning standards that require all of these things, we say like breaks this rule that like the question of where should cars be parked is really dealt with at a very granular level. But then there
Mhm.
are other overlays like a distributed energy system or a heat exchange system that is going to do that. And I'm fascinated by that. There's a technical thing to me that just occurred too, that one of the barriers that cities are facing is that residents are anti like any new development because they say like our systems are overloaded. But actually,
Mm,
there's ways that that the installation of solar can actually reduce the need for transfer stations and substations and all of that because you're not having to draw more down a big pipeline. You're actually just
right.
you're alleviating some of the responses. But a couple of questions that came up here was any ideas on covering parking lots for solar? Which says like, hey, it's not ideal, but at least then you get shade and you get
It actually
solar
is
and
ideal. We have somebody who does that here in San Antonio.
Mhm.
And I want to say Big Sun Solar, and their business model, they actually work with CPS Energy for which is the muni for San Antonio. And they made it part of a community solar setup. And one of the ways that they're able to basically provide cheaper energy to people is by selling covered parking spots.
Hmm.
So they find
Yeah,
somebody with a big old parking lot and they're like, okay, we'll develop this for you. You'll get the rent for a covered spot. You'll give some of that to us to cover the cost of capital and upstart. And then they create the billing system that then works with the utility to credit people for the panels that they own in that parking
that's
lot.
fascinating. Yeah,
And it's been
yeah.
fantastic, especially because they were able to put a system in place with the utility where people whose credit ratings really didn't allow them to get solar actually allowed them to participate in this program and kind of help their credit rating along the way. So it was kind of an enabling
Hmm.
um,
Hmm.
beyond just the solar. It's always fantastic when you see that.
Yeah.
These other ways, a lot of people trying to accomplish a lot of different goals with these projects. But yeah, if the parking lot is there,
Right.
that's fantastic. If the parking garage is there, putting the solar on the top, the top level, it's a great thing to do. It's a huge spot. It's heat island effect, with all the heat on that
Yeah.
concrete. And people like parking under the cover. So,
Hmm.
but
Hmm.
yeah, that's actually been a really good approach. And ground mounted is actually cheaper than rooftop.
Yeah.
Um, so that helps
So
as well.
I grew up on a dairy farm, and so I'm very sensitive to the idea that like the dirt beneath our feet, like we need to be very good stewards of it. And if we're going to determine that something is going to be not farmed or not, let to be in a natural state, that should be fine. But one of my concerns when I fly over different spaces is just the mass solar arrays that are being built. And
Yeah.
kind of two questions on that, and then would kind of throw it over to especially to Will, who's an electrical and commissioning engineer. And so, Will, you've probably got some curious things on your
Uh-oh,
mind too,
I'm
but
nervous.
that'll be good. It is just how is it that does it require regulation for solar companies to have to install it's sometimes even just as much as like a couple of feet of additional height, which I know increases like the wind load, but to allow for cattle to move beneath or to allow for even shade farming to take place. Like there's a lot of really innovative like shade farming that can take place in that
Mhm.
context. You're not going to be growing wheat or other really like your corn's not going to grow there, but I see so many that are rooted to the ground, which means
Mm,
there's just no like the surface
yeah.
is covered in panels rather than the surface being still available for water filtration, all of that sort of stuff. I don't know. That feels like to me one of those
Eh,
areas that as a farmer, I'm like, I don't like seeing fields of solar panels. But I do
Yeah.
like the idea of goats and sheep and cows and shade plants all growing in that space. Then it's like, oh, that's a win-win. How do we handle that?
It actually doesn't cover, even if it's covering the ground, it's not on the ground, so it actually can still help with water infiltration. They've also found that they can make a lot of those large installations pollinator friendly. They go in
Mm,
with
yeah,
wildflowers, and actually the farmers like having that adjacent, or in a field that's
yeah,
not operating. I forget what the term is. I'm not in
yeah.
agriculture. But
Fallow. Yeah,
you'll actually probably appreciate this if you've grown up on the farm. Uh, Mowing the grass around these can be quite challenging.
right.
So they said, okay, we'll have livestock come in and just eat. They had goats at first because we have a lot of that in Texas. They jump on the solar panels.
I love that.
So they're like jumping on the solar panels. They're like, oh, this is not going to do. So
Yeah.
it's now known that you use sheep for this purpose,
Mhm.
because they do not jump on the solar panels, but they will eat all the grass in and around and there are actually companies that will take sheep around to manage the grass overgrowing the solar panels, on these sites. So it might not be as bad as you think.
Mhm. Yeah.
It's still being used for something. A lot of times it's land that isn't good for anything else. or that isn't being used for anything else. I know at least here in Texas, it's pretty much all private land. It's up to the landowner,
Yeah.
if they're going to lease out their land for that purpose. And then you have, whatever kind of standard environmental permits you need, and then the interconnection agreements with the grid, going on that. So, in some sense, it's kind of, if there's a better use for that land, odds are good that the owner is going to do that.
Right.
But it
Yeah.
actually is a pretty harmless. I mean, if you look at kind of where it's being anchored into the land, it's kind of easy to remove,
Yeah.
in 30 years if there's another use. Um, so, it is an issue. You don't want to have, everything covered in solar. And actually one of the groups that I've worked with, they're from West Texas and they want to keep the environment a little clearer. So they're really investing in rooftop solar,
Right. Because that's
as a
already
way to say,
been.
hey,
Yep.
we have
Hmm.
all the roofs. We need
Yeah.
the power in the city anyway. Let's just use the roofs. How do we use the roofs?
Yeah.
Grocery stores are a great candidate for solar. And then you have the resiliency, especially if you put in the batteries. So you have a power outage, they can keep the food. When we went through Winter Storm Uri here in Texas, the grocery stores lost power. Uh, all the food was bad. It was like a
Mm.
huge news story when HEB started rolling the trucks up 35. People were like, "Oh, thank
Yeah.
it was like
Yeah.
it was getting pretty bare over here. I was really I was nervous. My pantry was getting pretty empty. I couldn't get out of my driveway for over a week. And then you find out there was no food at the grocery anyway, and you're like, this is not.
Yeah.
But so if you have that solar plus storage, you can get those critical systems. But yeah, I go through I definitely prefer the rooftop option.
Yeah.
Having said that, I think it's also important to realize that a lot of these kind of the times when we need resiliency, there's kind of some of the local systems are having issues. Like for us with Winter Storm Uri, our state is on its own grid,
Yeah.
and this huge storm came in and sat over the entire state.
Mm. Yeah.
So everything that was going wrong everywhere at once on our grid.
Yeah.
If we had had a grid tie-in, and just to know how bad it was, the nuclear power plant froze.
Right.
That is not one you think you're
Yeah.
going to lose. The
Yeah.
turbines froze, and we're like, wait, what?
Yeah. That's a very
Solar
different
was actually
nuclear
one of the better
winter.
performers.
Yeah.
But
Uh-huh.
if we had been tied to another grid, we would have avoided some loss of life.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
while having local resources can add a lot of resilience, and that those wouldn't have gone offline in those places, like hospitals with microgrids were good to go. Um, but the way I kind of look at it is being prepared to be an island is a source of resiliency, but being able to reach out for help
Yeah.
is also a type of
Yeah.
resiliency. And we need that geographic distribution to add security to the system. So there's a place for centralized and there's a place for local, and I think it has to be balanced. And the technology is now available. I think we can start bringing that into balance. And I'm hoping that, we'll do more resiliency planning. Watching the news the past couple days, all of our communities need resiliency planning. Watching what happened in Asheville, when that
Mhm.
happens, the quickest thing to do is to put it back the way it was.
Mhm.
But it's a 100-year-old system. The way it was is not necessarily the best thing to do.
Yeah.
But you can't start the planning phase when everything's broken and on the ground. You just have to put back what you know how to do. So I think
Yeah.
that planning ahead, having those resiliency plans as a community and say, what do we want to look like in 5 years, 10 years, 15 years? Let's be ready when these opportunities present themselves. Let's go ahead and take advantage of a bad situation and make sure we're stronger next time it happens.
Yeah.
Because we see it does happen, it does keep happening.
Mhm. Yeah.
And sometimes
Yeah.
to the same community. So it's, particularly on our Gulf Coast, it's, there's a lot. Louisiana has actually been taking the lead on a lot of solar since Katrina.
Mm. Yeah.
And they've had a lot of resiliency efforts with that. So, yeah, it's planning ahead.
Yeah. Yeah.
I
And
think I think that'll be a big part of it.
finding ways to leave the door open to sort of what does the next iteration on the idea look like
Mhm.
without saying like, oh, in, some mysterious thing we're going to trust. Like, no, there's got to be like,
Yeah.
that clarity and those opportunities to explore that. Want to open it up. We always, Ariana could chat for hours about this, but for Jay or for Jonathan or Kay or Will, jump in. I would love to hear thoughts, or John as well, but And Will, actually, maybe I'll put Will on the spot because he says, I'm an engineer for an investor-owned utility. And so what are some of the things that you're confronting in Hudson, Ohio, and the stuff that ties into what we're talking about?
Sure. So actually, the utility that I work for does not supply power to my house. We actually have a municipal utility in Hudson. They don't cover the entire city. So there is some that is my company, First Energy is my company.
Hmm.
And it's kind of a mix between the two, right? So we just happen to live in a house that is serviced by Hudson Public Power instead of by First Energy. Um, as far as the solar goes at this point, yeah, we do net metering. I know a little bit less, I think, about the distribution side of the business and the transmission side of the business.
Yeah.
And I know that's kind of where, especially as we kind of electrify a lot more of our cars or our HVAC systems going forward in the future to more efficient, less fossil fuel hungry devices, that I know there's a lot of concern about transmission capacity and
Mhm.
um, that's something that's always on my mind. I don't know. I don't work in the lines. I work in substations,
Mhm.
but we it's just something that's come up to me before. And I remember you mentioned about the cost recovery for capital expenses, and then that's been I've been with the company. It's going to be 9 years in May, and it's like we have to do timesheets even though we're salaried just for the accounting purposes.
Hmm.
And
Mhm.
it's make sure you
Yeah.
charge all your time to capital is and whenever you can because we've been on formula rates since 2014. I started in 2016, and yeah, that's the goal is to charge as much to capital to do capital projects because that's where we get the returns that we wouldn't necessarily get for operation and maintenance expenses.
Right. Yeah, if you're not for those if you're not familiar with the if when it's operations and maintenance, it's just a kind of a one-to-one recovery.
Yeah.
It just goes into the regular rate and you get the payback, but you don't get profit. So when it's capital, when it's that kind of improvement, that's when you can get the 10% on top.
Yeah.
Capital meaning we're installing something new or we're replacing something old with something
Yeah.
new.
It feels like there's a Freakonomics episode or a Strong Towns episode on just like the perverse incentives that are potentially
It's
lurking in these types of setups.
it is, and I always try to remind myself, people get in when you work in that kind of system, you get in a habit of thought
Mhm.
where you maximize for that system. And it's not always that you're trying to take advantage or nefarious. You just train your brain to kind of think that this is the way we structure it.
Yeah.
And I just want to say that because as we make this transition, there are people who kind of, feel like, oh, they're trying to take advantage or they're trying to do this. And there some are, but there are a lot who just, that's just kind of the way it's always been done. And that's the way they think about it and plan it. And it hasn't really, that's just, kind
Mhm.
of what you have to do. Um, but yeah, it doesn't, I don't know that it leads to the best design options all the time. And he's right about, I think, the transmission and distribution. That yeah, as we start using more electricity and the data centers that are coming online, they're expecting most of the growth in our electricity system to be coming from data centers
Mhm.
over the next, I think, 5 to 10 years. And so yeah, you definitely end up with where you have to do expansions on the transmission distribution, and that's a huge expense. And so to me, that's where looking at the distributed solar and really
Yeah.
having the initiative. But if that's how you recoup your profit, is that how you get your profit is to put in more transmission and distribution? You're not necessarily going to be looking for those solutions that avoid
Doing
those
that. Right.
expenditures.
Yeah.
That
Yeah.
it's just naturally, that's just, what is it with if you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail. So it's
Mhm.
it's going to
Mhm.
be kind of that case.
You
So
could
that's
extend the life of a piece of equipment by repairing it, but if you're not incentivized to do that, which that might be at lower cost, you're kind of incentivized to spend more so that you can recover more to do a replacement instead of a repair
Yeah.
or an
Yeah.
upgrade or something.
exactly. And then there are a lot of people who are supplying that equipment too. So you end up with a whole ecosystem of people who are very dependent on the way this has been done for the last 100 years. And it's big, it's the same thing that Strongtown sees with all the planning and zoning that they look at. When you have all of these systems that have been in place for 100 years, you can't just change them overnight.
Yeah.
One of the things I really like about the bottom up is it allows slower change, so you can start to see which models work and how the incumbents can actually start to adjust to be a part of that system.
Yeah.
It's certainly easier to just keep doing things the way you've done them. There has to be some outside pressure that says we're going to be looking for new solutions. We're going to be doing it differently.
Yeah.
And that can be customers that are looking for more innovative utilities, but if they don't have the choice to move to a different utility, then they can't necessarily apply that pressure. I think the resiliency planning will put a lot of onus on cities and communities to be able to place more demands. Have a motivation to place these demands, and get involved, because if it's a separate industry, you're like, okay, well, that's just what they do. But when you're like, well, hang on a second, this is a life critical system. We're the city. We have to make sure our residents are taken care of. We need to know that there's planning. We need to know that we're engaging on this. I think that's where you can start to see some of those changes. But I do think that bottom up allows incremental is, it's going to be less painful for everybody involved as we, kind of transition. Because we're talking about kind of two transitions, one to renewable energy and one to kind of this energy democracy, where more people get to be a part of the system. And those are two really big changes.
And that bottom up also has to respond to a lot more frequent but smaller scale stressors. And those stressors, I think, are such critical bits of that feedback loop and really important. And it is actually one of the areas where, like, our utilities, so our sewer, our water, our hydro, or we call it hydro in BC, but is stuff where we are doing cost recovery. Whereas, like, our roads, we, for some reason in the political calculus, don't do cost recovery on roads very well. And as a result, like, there's not really a clear understanding of who pays for what, not a real understanding of what the true cost is. And so as challenging as these utility sort of questions are, I think they actually are part of helping us to see, like, hey, many other elements of the operating system of your community also function in this way, only there's a lot less visibility. And that's where the lurking sort of looming problems are going to come from. But Jay, jump in. I would love to hear your thoughts too, as a Texan.
Yeah, no, so I was kind of more curious. So you talked about like community microgrids. I mean, how are those established, or kind of what are some examples of where that's been done, and what kind of led to the prompting of having that part built out?
I'm trying to think. I'm not sure I know that many examples of where they've been done. I know in the Miller community, they kind of did one with the hospital district. And the idea there was actually for resiliency. You want to make sure the hospital has that power. Sometimes you end up with it with the when communities are being developed. But yeah, I mean, the idea there is that if you can kind of generate your own power rather than having the whole city go out, you have this small section that can flip the switch and island from the grid and, keep all the energy, keep the power running. I think they're doing this more and more for when they're doing resiliency centers, things like fire stations or community centers and places like that. And it usually integrates, more than one meter. So that's where you're going to end up, where it's not just like solar plus battery. It's where you have multiple buildings and multiple entities that can draw on that power. And it might require everybody to kind of reduce their power a little bit, but then it doesn't go out completely, is, I think, kind of the idea there.
As I say, Will, I know that you're an electrical engineer. You said you work on the transmission side. I mean, how does that kind of work? I mean, do you even know, or is that just something that's kind of foreign to you?
You're talking like microgrids?
Yeah, microgrid type things.
Yeah, this is something that was kind of a new concept to me,
Okay.
3 to 6 months ago. So I don't really know much about them. Like I said, I work in substations, mostly big high voltage transmission grid. And, I do like kind of learning more about the sort of solutions that are out there as far as like protection and operation of the system. So we deal with a couple of different manufacturers of microprocessor based relays that offer these microgrid solutions. But I haven't really looked too much into those. I'm aware of them, and that's pretty much it at this point.
Yeah, and the reason I was asking is, I mean, whether it be an apartment complex, a condo complex, or something like that, wanting to set up kind of that type of environment, what would the infrastructure requirements be and things like that? It's kind of what I was kind of Hope you get.
I mean, you have to have a generation source, and sometimes people, can use a small generator. Sometimes, frequently, it is solar plus battery. But yeah, I mean, the main thing to kind of qualify as a microgrid would be that you have a source of generation and then a way to distribute that generation to multiple buildings or multiple meters. And so that's where it can get a little tricky because you do have to somebody doing a little bit of maintenance and management, to making sure that all those, controls and relays are going to actually work.
Mhm.
I think that's kind of the main thing. There are companies who do that. I haven't looked at as much into that kind of technical solution of exactly how do we go from just having, generation in 5 meters, say, to actually like managing the energy. Because obviously, with the energy system, it has to be perfectly balanced, so
And is
that
that
management part is the tricky part with the microgrid, and I'm not really sure how they're doing that.
like Tesla got a lot of press because in Australia they were able to handle the peak loads with their battery storage system, so that way stuff was being generated. They were able to and there was, I don't know if this is lore, but it seemed to check out that because they were able to switch on so rapidly to be able to cover peak, it actually resulted in them having to go to the utilities and say, you actually owe us more because we were supplementing your grid so frequently that you didn't even notice. Like your systems, when you turn on your natural gas
Oh,
plant, are
okay.
slower. And so then the contractor that owns the natural
Yeah.
gas plant says, my plant fired up. But the grid was being balanced so frequently. So do you know of advances in storage that are is storage keeping up with generation? Because it feels like this, when the rain is, or when the sun is shining, when the wind is blowing, then all of a sudden you've got power. And that is, the big Achilles heel is it needs to be stored, and electricity
Right.
doesn't store very well unless it's turned into heat or turned into steam.
Mhm.
What at some of these communities, when they do a microgrid, are they involving storage, or is it just like they charge up the batteries of all the electric cars that happen to be plugged in? Like it sounds like there's
A
a
lot of
ton of
people
different ways
dream
to do
about
it.
the electric car thing. As an electric car owner, I'm not too keen on having the grid like draw the power out of my battery and then I
Mhm.
need to go somewhere. It's supposed to be like better controlled than that, but I'm still a little on it.
Yeah,
Especially because you're wearing out the
right.
battery. You're using cycles on the
Different
battery as
cycles. Yeah.
well. So
Hmm.
I'm not sure how comfortable people are going to be with doing that, though I know the software and hardware are there to be able to do it. The price of batteries have come way down. I mean, they're continuing to come down. They've
Hmm.
actually started to get to where they're reasonable. I mean, 5 years ago, it is kind of a luxury, like special, thing. Very few people did it. I think now a lot of the installers that we work with are saying they're getting about 50% of their systems are installing batteries as well. And part of that is also having the smart inverters that don't need the grid for support. That
Mm-hmm.
gets into a lot more technical stuff,
Yeah.
but yeah, so you've got the smart inverters now, and you've got the batteries coming down in price quite a bit, and then you do have the pressures from people who are looking for a generator substitute. They don't want to put a generator on their house, and putting the batteries on with the solar is going to be cheaper than getting a whole separate generator, um, for emergencies. So.
Hmm.
But yeah, I mean, in order to be a microgrid, you would have to have the storage.
Hmm.
The intermittency would just be too much to, kind of do that totally isolated. You'd have to do a lot of load control. The lights would probably flash, but yeah, the batteries. In some cases, the batteries help just even out the power
Yeah.
as well. But yeah,
Yeah.
they're a very quick response. So, but yeah, I'm gonna have to look for that on the Tesla batteries and see
Yeah.
what resolution they're looking at, because yeah, that's an interesting.
Yeah, it
I've
was
seen that.
not
It
their
happened
power
with.
wall, but their large scale energy installations that they had
Yeah.
done, and then just the load balancing that it was doing. And I mean, this is also, there's an element of traffic, that peak traffic, when we design just for peak traffic and keep increasing our capacity,
Mhm.
but do nothing to sort of balance the load. And the energy system is like, oh, we've been working on that side of it, and that is what allows us to really manage how much more capacity we need to build, unless there's a perverse incentive, which is always keep building capacity and keep creating those
Yeah.
things. But with that, we're almost at the top of the hour. Ariane, thank you. And I hope that for those that are watching this, just know and appreciate that Ariane has kind of dipped our toes into a whole field of study that I think is really valuable, certainly contributes to us being able to talk together as our energy systems stay current and functional. Ariane has been a friend to Strong Towns for a number of years. You've been a member since 2017. I don't know if you
Has
remember
it?
first signing up, 83 donations already. So thank you
Oh,
for being an awesome part of the Strong Towns movement. And thanks everybody for joining in today. And as always, yeah, keep it up. And I'm so grateful for the time that we could spend on,
absolutely. Thank you.
I find a fascinating topic. Yeah. Last word to you.
Last word to me. Actually, something that didn't come up that I would like to throw out there for because I know there are a lot of people in the Incremental Development Alliance with Strong Towns. I don't know if they're looking into putting solar on their developments, but I would encourage them to look at that. I'd be happy to try to help find some technical assistance to do a seminar because there are actually green loans as well, where the banks will
Mhm.
help
Yeah.
kind of work that in. And I think that would be a fantastic kind of place to start with resiliency, kind of added onto those projects if they're game. So,
Oh, that's awesome.
and I
We
suppose I
will.
should say hook 'em as a Texas Longhorn.
Very good. Take care, everybody. Have a great rest of the day.